My name is Rachel Carter. I'm 35 now, a middle manager at a software company in Seattle. But the story I'm about to tell you starts long before boardrooms and deadlines. It starts in a house in Bellevue, Washington, where I grew up learning one lesson over and over again. No matter how much I gave, it was never enough. Before I dive in, let me pause for a second. If stories about family betrayal, survival, and clawing your way out of toxic expectations resonate with you, please subscribe, like, and share this channel. Your support doesn't just help me, it creates a space for all of us who have lived through the same silent battles. Now, let me take you back. I was 16 the day the first real crack formed in me, a fissure so sharp it still aches like a phantom limb. It was early fall, and the maple trees that lined our street had just started to bleed red into the sidewalks. I can still hear the crunch of leaves under my sneakers when I walked home, clutching the chemistry test I'd worked so hard on. A B+. To most kids, it would have been a relief. To me, it was the end of the world. Because in our house, perfection wasn't celebrated, it was demanded. I remember standing in the kitchen, handing the paper to my dad, Frank. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at the grade, and exhaled through his nose like he was already disappointed. "Why isn't this an A?" he asked flatly. My stomach twisted. "It's just one test, Dad. Don't give me excuses. You're supposed to set the example for your brother." His voice hardened with every syllable. My mom, Linda, chimed in while stirring spaghetti sauce on the stove. "Rachel, you're wasting your potential. Do you want Ethan to think half-hearted work is acceptable?" Ethan, he was 8 then, sprawled on the couch in the living room, a video game controller in his hands, the glow from the TV flickering across his round face. He barely looked up when Mom said his name. I felt my throat tighten, the way it does right before tears, but I refused to cry in front of them. "It's a B+, I whispered, my voice shaky. "It's still good." Dad's hand came down on the counter with a sharp crack that made the sauce spoon tremble. "A month. Grounded. No phone, no outings, nothing until you prove you can take school seriously." The words knocked the air out of me. I stood frozen, heart pounding, my palms sweaty against the edge of the counter. My chest burned as if I were locked in too tight a corset, and my head buzzed with disbelief. That night, I sat in my room staring at the pale pink wallpaper I had long outgrown, feeling like the walls were pressing closer. My mind kept circling the same question: why am I never enough? And then, as if the universe wanted to twist the knife, Ethan's voice drifted through the vent between our rooms. He was laughing. 2 days later, the contrast became unbearable. I walked into the kitchen to grab a glass of water and froze. Dad's wallet was open on the table, bills missing. Ethan stood sheepishly across from him, his little hands behind his back. "Ethan," Dad said, trying and failing to sound stern. "Did you take from my wallet again?" Ethan's lip quivered in what I now recognize as a well-practiced act. "I just needed a little for candy. I'm sorry, Dad." I braced myself for the explosion. If a B+ had earned me a month of prison-like grounding, stealing had to be catastrophic. But Dad sighed, rubbed his temples, and muttered, "You can't keep doing this, son." Mom came in, placing a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder. "He's going through a phase. Don't be too hard on him." A phase. I couldn't stop myself. "Are you kidding me? He stole from you. That's worse than a grade." Mom's eyes snapped to me, sharp and cutting. "Rachel, don't overreact. He's sensitive. He'll grow out of it." I wanted to scream. My fists clenched so hard my nails bit into my palms, tiny crescents of pain grounding me in the moment. "When I make a mistake, you punish me. When he does, you excuse it. How is that fair?" Dad's gaze was cold. "Because you know better. You're supposed to be responsible. You're the older one." The older one. The responsible one. The scapegoat. The shield. The lesson in flesh and blood. That night I lay awake, listening again to Ethan's muffled laughter through the wall. My grounding meant no TV, no phone, no friends. He had stolen, lied, and walked away with nothing but a pat on the head. The unfairness settled into me like a stone in the pit of my stomach. My body felt heavy, as though someone had draped a lead blanket over me. Every inhale burned, every exhale came out shaky. In the silence, my mind began to split in two, one part screaming in rage, the other whispering in fear. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm supposed to carry it all. Maybe I'm selfish for even questioning it. It was the first time I realized that love in my house came with conditions. Ethan's mistakes were softened, forgiven, forgotten. Mine were magnified, punished, immortalized, and that realization didn't make me stronger then. It made me smaller. I felt myself folding inward, the way paper creases under pressure, terrified that if I pushed back, I'd tear. Years later, when I tell people about my childhood, they often shrug, say, "Every family has favorites." But it wasn't favoritism. It was something colder. It was a system, a script. I was cast as the example, the responsible one, the fixer. Ethan was the golden child, the fragile one to be protected at all costs. That night, 16 years old and grounded over a B+, I stared out my bedroom window at the streetlight haloing red leaves. I made myself a promise, silent but fierce. When I'm old enough, I'll get out. I'll never need them again. I didn't know then how heavy that vow would become, how many times it would be tested. But in that moment, it was the only thing keeping me from breaking. And that was the crack. The first fracture that told me my family wasn't safe ground but quicksand. It would take me years to crawl out, to fight my way free, and even longer to realize that no amount of sacrifice could fix what was broken in them. But at 16, all I knew was the burn of injustice, the choke of silence, and the quiet, desperate promise to myself that one day I'd stop being the scapegoat. When I promised myself at 16 that I'd get out, I didn't realize how brutal that journey would be. But I kept that vow. And when I finally left Bellevue, it was like stepping out of a suffocating room into sharp, cold air. At 18, I packed 2 duffel bags and rode the Metro bus across Lake Washington to Seattle. The skyline looked like a fortress of glass and steel, intimidating and alive all at once. I didn't have much, a few $100s saved from working part-time at a coffee shop in high school, and a stubborn streak that had been forged from years of being told I wasn't enough. Seattle became my battlefield. I enrolled at the University of Washington, a state school I could barely afford. Every penny mattered. In the mornings, I wore a green apron and called out lattes in a crowded coffee shop in Capitol Hill. At night, I traded that apron for a black polo and an order pad at a 24-hour diner near campus. My days blurred together. Steam from espresso machines, the clatter of dishes, and the ache in my legs from standing 16 hours straight. There were nights I'd collapse on the thin mattress in the small studio I shared with a roommate, ramen steaming in a styrofoam cup balanced on the windowsill. Through the cracked window, I could hear rain tapping against the fire escape, a rhythm that matched the throb in my temples. I was exhausted, but I was free, and that freedom was worth every blister on my feet. Meanwhile, Ethan's gap year stretched into 5. I'd call home every once in a while, partly out of guilt, partly out of some stubborn hope that maybe things had changed. But the conversations always sounded the same. Mom's voice. "Your brother's just figuring things out. He's sensitive, Rachel. Don't compare your paths." Dad's sigh. "He'll get there eventually. You're doing fine, but don't rub it in his face." And then the kicker, every single time. "Can you help him out just a little? You know, until he finds his footing?" Help him out. Those words became a mantra in our house, a kind of family prayer. Except the prayer was always directed at me. One Thanksgiving, when I was 21, I drove my beat-up Honda Civic to Bellevue. I remember the smell of roasted turkey hitting me the second I stepped through the door, and the muffled hum of football on the TV. Ethan was 20 now, still living in the basement, still job hunting. He leaned against the kitchen counter, scrolling his phone while Mom handed him a plate piled high with stuffing. I reached for the mashed potatoes, and Mom turned to me with that same expectant look. "Rachel, your brother's car broke down last week. He can't get to interviews. Do you think you could lend him a few $100 until he gets back on his feet?" The fork froze halfway to my mouth. "I'm barely covering rent and tuition. I don't have hundreds just lying around." Ethan didn't even look up. "You make more than I do." His tone was casual, dismissive, as if that was the end of the discussion. I laughed, sharp and bitter. "Of course I do. You don't make anything?" The room went silent. Dad cleared his throat. "Rachel, that's uncalled for." But it wasn't uncalled for. It was the truth, and the truth had no place in that house. Back in Seattle, I kept grinding. I graduated with honors, the kind of diploma you want to wave in your parents' faces and say, "See? Look what I did without you." But when I told them, Mom's first response wasn't pride. It was, "Don't brag too much, Rachel. You'll make your brother feel bad." That sentence hollowed me out. I had starved, worked, borrowed, clawed my way through college, and their biggest concern was Ethan's feelings. I remember hanging up the phone and staring at the screen until it dimmed, my reflection faint in the black glass. For a moment, I wanted to throw it against the wall. Instead, I placed it gently on the desk, pressed my palms to my eyes, and let myself cry. Not the dramatic sobs of a teenager, but the quiet, steady tears of someone realizing that the people who should cheer for you are rooting against you. Seattle kept teaching me resilience. I climbed the corporate ladder one rung at a time, saying yes to overtime, volunteering for projects no one else wanted, studying certifications at night while the city outside my window pulsed with life I couldn't afford to join. Each achievement was mine alone. And yet, each time my parents found a way to twist it back to Ethan. When I bought my first car, a used Toyota Corolla I paid off in cash, Dad said, "Don't flaunt it. Ethan's still taking the bus." When I rented my first one-bedroom apartment in Queen Anne, Mom said, "I hope you're not making your brother feel left behind." It was endless. My success was never just mine. It was weighed against Ethan's failures, and somehow I was responsible for the balance. The final straw came 2 years ago, when I closed on my first home in Seattle. A small craftsman-style house with peeling blue paint, but it was mine. I walked through the empty rooms, my footsteps echoing on hardwood floors, sunlight streaming through dusty windows, and I felt a surge of pride that nearly knocked me off my feet. That night, I called my parents, hoping just this once for genuine congratulations. Dad's voice was flat. "Well, I hope this doesn't make Ethan feel worse about where he is." Something in me broke then, quietly but irreversibly. It wasn't a loud shatter, more like the sound of glass cracking under pressure. I realized I would never be enough for them, not because of anything I did, but because Ethan would always be protected, and I would always be measured against him. Still, I kept pushing forward. I built my career, managed my finances, created a life in Seattle that was mine alone. But no matter how far I went, the shadow of my family loomed. Calls from Mom always carried that same rhythm. Small talk like sugarcoating, followed by the ask. And deep down, I kept that 16-year-old promise alive. I will never need them. What I didn't know then was how hard they would try to make me break it. The first time my phone lit up with Mom's name that evening, I almost didn't answer. I was sitting at my desk in my small home office in Seattle, a mug of lukewarm chamomile tea by my elbow, reviewing a project timeline for work. Outside, the city hummed quietly, distant car tires against wet pavement, the faint whir of the neighbor's lawnmower in the fading light. It was an ordinary weeknight, the kind I clung to as proof that I had built something steady, but when I saw Mom glowing across the screen, my chest tightened. Linda Carter never called to check in. She wasn't the type to ask about my day or my cat, or if I'd tried a new restaurant. If she was calling, it meant she wanted something. I hesitated, thumb hovering, and then answered. "Hi, Mom." Her voice came through overly bright, sugar-coated in a way that immediately put me on guard. "Rachel, honey, it's so good to hear your voice. How's work? You're still at that computer company, right?" I bit the inside of my cheek. She couldn't even remember the name of the place where I'd worked for 5 years. "Yeah, still there. Busy as always." "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Are you eating well? Taking care of yourself? You know, you've been single for a while since, She trailed off, pretending to search for the word. "Since the engagement ended?" I filled in for her. My stomach clenched. She knew the wound, and she pressed it anyway. Oh, right. Such a shame. You deserve someone solid, like your brother. He's always been such a sensitive soul. There it was. The shift. I could hear it sliding in, like a knife hidden in velvet. I leaned back in my chair, fingers drumming the wood. "What's going on, Mom?" Her voice cracked, rehearsed sobs slipping through the line. "It's Ethan. He's in terrible trouble. He owes money, $40,000, to some very dangerous people." The number slammed into me like a fist to the chest. I sat up straighter, heat rising to my face. 40,000? How the hell does someone even get into that kind of debt? "That doesn't matter right now," she snapped, then quickly softened her tone. "What matters is he's your brother. He needs you. Family helps family." That phrase, family helps family, was their weapon of choice. I'd heard it my entire life, wielded like a chain around my neck. I rubbed my temple, my pulse hammering. "Mom, that's a down payment on a house. That's my entire emergency fund. I can't just—" "You've always been the strong one, Rachel," she interrupted, her voice pitching higher, trembling. "Jason can't handle this kind of pressure. You know how he gets. He's fragile. He's not like you. Fragile, sensitive, excuses wrapped as endearments." I gripped the edge of the desk until my knuckles whitened. "I'm sorry, but I can't bail him out of this. Not this time." The silence on the other end was heavy, suffocating. Then, like a switch flipping, her tone hardened, venom seeping through each word. "You selfish girl." I froze. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? We sacrificed for you. We gave you every opportunity, and now you're going to abandon your own brother? You're leaving him to the wolves?" Her voice climbed higher, ragged with fury. "Do you want his blood on your hands?" My breath caught, shallow and sharp. It was absurd, manipulative, but the words lodged deep, stoking an old fear, that somehow his failures were mine to fix. I tried to steady my voice, but it came out cracked. "This isn't my responsibility. I didn't gamble away $40,000. I didn't borrow from criminals," she hissed into the phone. "If anything happens to him, Rachel, you'll never forgive yourself." For a moment, I couldn't speak. My throat felt raw, my body trembling as if my nerves had been stripped bare. The office around me blurred. All I could hear was her voice, sharp and cold, echoing years of guilt and expectation. Finally, I whispered, "I can't, Mom. I won't." There was a sharp inhale, a sharp click. The line went dead. I set the phone down on the desk, staring at it as though it might explode. My hands shook so badly I had to press them into my lap. My chest felt like a vice, tightening with each breath. The guilt flooded in almost immediately, familiar as an old scar. I'd stood my ground, but the voice in my head, the one they planted years ago, whispered, "Maybe she's right. Maybe you are selfish. Maybe his blood will be on your hands." I pushed back from the desk, pacing the room. My reflection caught in the darkened window, face pale, eyes wide, shoulders hunched as if I'd just been struck. I didn't recognize myself. I grabbed the tea mug, took a sip, but the liquid was bitter and cold. I slammed it back onto the desk, porcelain clinking too loud in the silence. I had spent years building this life, brick by brick. Every long night, every missed party, every dollar saved, it was all mine. And yet, in a 5-minute phone call, my mother tried to dismantle it all, dragging me back into the role I'd been forced to play since childhood, the responsible one, the scapegoat, the fixer. Not this time. But even as I repeated those words to myself, the guilt gnawed, relentless. The 16-year-old girl who had once promised to escape stood beside me again, whispering, "What if they're right? What if you're abandoning him?" I shook my head hard, forcing the thought away. No, this wasn't about being selfish. This was about survival. I crawled into bed that night, pulling the blankets tight around me as if they could shield me from their words. But sleep didn't come. Every creak of the house made me jolt. Every shadow stretched long across the walls. And beneath it all, a cold realization sank in. This wasn't over. When my parents wanted something, they didn't take no for an answer. And this time, it wasn't just money on the line. It was me. The morning after my mother's call, I was still carrying the weight of her words. My head ached from a night of restless tossing, her voice replaying like a scratched record. "Do you want his blood on your hands?" I tried to bury myself in work. It was a Wednesday, mid-morning, when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. At first, I almost let it go to voicemail. I'd had enough of phone calls that shook me to the core, but something made me swipe to answer. "Hello?" A clipped, professional voice responded. "This is Karen from the Fraud Prevention Department at First Northwest Bank. Is this Rachel Carter?" My stomach dropped. "Yes. What's going on?" She cleared her throat. "We detected unusual activity on your checking account early this morning. Someone attempted to transfer a large sum of money, $35,000, to an external account. Our systems flagged it, and we froze the attempt. Can I confirm if this transaction was authorized by you?" The words blurred. For a second, I couldn't breathe. 35,000, practically my entire safety net. "No," I said quickly, my voice cracking. "Absolutely not. I didn't authorize anything." "All right," she continued, calm but firm. "The reason I'm calling is because whoever attempted this used correct answers to several of your security questions. Your mother's maiden name, the name of your childhood pet, even your first-grade teacher, details not usually available to outsiders." My pulse hammered in my ears. The room spun slightly, and I had to grip the edge of my desk to stay grounded. "So you're telling me it was someone who knows me, personally?" "Yes," she said gently. "Do you have any idea who might have access to this information?" Images flooded my mind. Family dinners, childhood photos, the little dog I'd adored when I was 8. There was only one person reckless enough, entitled enough, and close enough to know all of it. Ethan. The realization struck like ice water down my spine. My own brother. I swallowed hard, forcing words out past the lump in my throat. "Yeah," I whispered. "I think I do." When the call ended, I sat frozen. My fingers trembled on the phone screen. My body felt both heavy and hollow, as if someone had scooped me out and left only a shell. I'd been betrayed before, by favoritism, by manipulation, by years of being cast as the villain. But this was different. This wasn't guilt-tripping. This wasn't words thrown like stones. This was theft. This was a knife in the back, wielded by blood. I pressed my palms into my eyes, trying to stop the tears that were hot and insistent. My mind replayed the scene at Thanksgiving, Ethan scrolling his phone while I scraped by. The casual tone when he said, "You make more than I do." And now, he had tried to take it all. That evening, I called Aunt Margaret. Out of everyone in the family, she was the only one who had ever seen me for me. She lived 3 hours away in Portland, but distance hadn't dulled her perception. When she answered, her voice was warm but cautious. "Rachel, you sound shaken. What happened?" I told her everything. The call, the attempted transfer, the security questions only family would know. By the time I finished, my hands were clenched so tightly the phone left indentations on my palm. She was silent for a long moment. Then, "Sweetheart, I wish I could say I was surprised, but I'm not." Her words cracked something inside me. Tears spilled freely now, hot and unstoppable. "He tried to steal from me, Aunt Margaret. My own brother. And Mom, she asked me for $40,000 just last night. Do you think—" "Yes," she interrupted softly. "I do. I think they're working together, or at the very least enabling him. They've always excused his behavior. Why would this be any different?" I pressed my forehead against the cool window pane, Seattle's nightlights blurring outside. "I want to believe I'm wrong. I want to believe family doesn't do this." "But family does," she said firmly. "And yours has for years. You've been carrying this on your own shoulders too long. It's time to protect yourself." Her certainty was like a lifeline. For the first time that day, I felt my feet touch solid ground. The next morning, I went to the bank in person. I sat across from a man in a navy suit, another fraud investigator, while he slid a folder of paperwork toward me. "We've secured your accounts, Ms. Carter," he said. New passwords, new security questions, but I'd advise you to monitor everything closely. Whoever attempted this had enough personal detail to be dangerous. I signed the forms with a shaking hand. What happens if it happens again? He looked me straight in the eye. Then you'll need to involve law enforcement. Do you want to file a report now? I hesitated. The idea of calling the police on my own brother made bile rise in my throat. But then I pictured my savings draining away in the dead of night, years of sweat and sacrifice gone in a blink. Not yet, I said finally, but I'll be ready. That night, lying awake in my house, I thought about the call from Mom, about Ethan's attempt to hack into my account. My chest felt tight, my body restless, caught between fury and grief. I had always feared losing my family, but now I realized something darker. I'd never truly had them to begin with. What I had was a role to play, a script I was forced into. And the second I stepped out of character, they turned on me. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was spiritual. They had chosen him again and again, even when it meant sacrificing me. I stared at the ceiling until dawn crept gray through the blinds, and I made myself another vow. If Ethan came near my life, my accounts, or my home again, I wouldn't just defend myself. I'd fight back. Because this wasn't about family anymore. This was survival. The drive to Tacoma felt longer than 45 minutes. Every mile down I-5 stretched out like a taut wire, humming with dread. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly the leather dug into my palms, and I couldn't shake the image of my bank balance blinking zero. I had told myself I was just going to confront him, to get answers. But beneath that resolve throbbed something rawer, anger, sharp and uncontainable. By the time I pulled into his run-down apartment complex, the sun was dipping low, painting the sky in streaks of bruised purple. The building looked like it had given up long ago, cracked stucco, flickering hallway lights, trash spilling from overflowing bins. I climbed the narrow staircase and knocked. For a long minute, nothing. Then the door creaked open, and there he was, Ethan. Unshaven, dark circles under his eyes, a faded Seahawks t-shirt hanging off his frame. He looked older than 27, but not in the way life hardens you, more like rot had set in early. He smirked faintly. "You actually came." I pushed the door wider and stepped in, the smell hitting me immediately. Stale smoke, beer, something sour underneath. My stomach tightened. The living room was dim, lit by a single lamp with a crooked shade. On the coffee table I saw them. A scatter of prepaid phones, envelopes with other people's names, and a stack of credit card bills. He noticed my gaze and casually swept them into a drawer, as if I hadn't seen. My voice trembled, more with fury than fear. "Did you try to hack my account?" He didn't even blink. "Mom said you'd crack if things got bad enough. I was just speeding up the process." The words knocked the air from my lungs. He said it like he was talking about the weather, not confessing to stealing from his own sister. I took a step closer, my voice rising. "Do you hear yourself? You tried to steal $35,000 from me. That's not speeding up the process. That's a crime." He shrugged, eyes flat. "You've got it. I don't. You've always had it easier." I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the cramped room. "Easier? I worked 2 jobs through college while you lived rent-free in Bellevue. Easier?" My voice cracked. "You have no idea what the word means." Before he could answer, the door swung open behind me. I spun around. Mom and Dad. Linda rushed in, her face streaked with tears, as if she'd rehearsed this scene. Frank followed, jaw set tight, radiating disapproval. "Rachel," Mom sobbed, "how could you storm in here and attack your brother when he's at his lowest?" "Attack him?" My hands flew up. "He tried to rob me from my own bank account." Ethan shifted uneasily but didn't deny it. That silence was louder than any confession. Dad's face darkened. He was desperate. What choice did he have when his own sister turned her back on him? I stared, incredulous. So bank fraud is acceptable now? Identity theft is fine, as long as it's family? Mom's voice rose, shrill and desperate. "He was cornered. People are after him, Rachel. Dangerous people. If you cared about family, you'd understand. The words stabbed deep. If you cared about family. Always twisted, always a cudgel. My chest heaved, years of swallowed rage clawing up. You've been excusing him since he was a child. Every mistake, every lie, every theft, you waved it away. And I paid the price. Do you know what it feels like to work yourself to the bone and still be told it's not enough? They stared, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. You let me drown in debt while you funded his failures. You grounded me for a B+, but you excused him stealing from your wallet. And now you're standing here defending him trying to steal from me. Do you even hear yourselves? Ethan's lips twisted into a grin. At least I'm not some stuck-up robot who thinks she's better than everyone. Mom nodded, unbelievably, as if his words were truth. Something inside me snapped. Years of humiliation, of guilt forced down like medicine erupted. My voice shook, but it was steady with conviction. I pulled out my phone, thumb hovering over the screen. You know what? I recorded this. All of it. You just admitted to bank fraud, Ethan. And you two, I pointed at my parents, hand trembling. You defended it. If anything happens to my accounts again, this goes straight to the police. For the first time, I saw fear flicker across Ethan's face. He stepped back, his bravado cracking. Mom gasped. How could you do this to your family? Threatening us like criminals? Dad's voice was low, menacing. He grabbed my arm, his grip iron. If you walk out that door, don't ever expect to be welcomed back. You'll no longer be one of us. I yanked free, glaring up at him, my pulse roaring in my ears. That sounds more like a promise than a threat. Silence. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then I turned, walked to the door, and left. My heart pounded as I descended the stairs, each step heavier than the last, but also lighter. Because for the first time, I wasn't just enduring, I was fighting back. Out in the parking lot, the cool Tacoma air hit me, sharp and clean. I inhaled deeply, my whole body trembling with adrenaline and grief. I knew what I had just done couldn't be undone. There was no going back. And maybe, just maybe, that was the point. When I walked out of Ethan's apartment in Tacoma, my heart was still jackhammering, adrenaline flooding every nerve. The night air slapped against my face, sharp with the smell of wet asphalt and cigarette smoke drifting from the balcony above. My whole body trembled, not just from fear, but from the release of 20 years of swallowed rage. I didn't drive away immediately. I sat in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel, phone buzzing with unanswered calls behind me. Mom, Dad, even Ethan, though I hadn't saved his number. They were probably upstairs, fuming, spinning the story already. My thumb hovered over the voice recorder app. It was still running. I glanced down at the glowing red bar crawling across the screen, proof that the last 30 minutes, the confessions, the excuses, the threats, had been captured. My hand shook as I hit stop. A file saved. Evidence. For the first time in years, I felt a kind of power they couldn't touch. But power came with terror, too. I knew the moment I used that recording there was no going back. No Thanksgiving dinners, no obligatory holiday calls, no pretending we were ever a normal family. If I crossed this line, I would be alone. And yet, hadn't I been alone all along? The next morning in Seattle, I sat at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, staring at my laptop screen. Their messages filled my phone. Mom, you're tearing this family apart. Dad, delete that recording before you regret it. Ethan, you'll be sorry if you don't help me. Each one made my chest clench, but instead of breaking me, they clarified things. They weren't trying to save Ethan. They were trying to preserve control. I opened a blank email. My fingers hovered over the keys. To Aunt Margaret, my cousins, my uncle in Spokane, even my grandmother who still used AOL. For years, I'd kept their secrets. I'd swallowed the dysfunction and let them dictate the narrative, but not anymore. Before I could type, my phone rang. Mom again. Against my better judgment, I answered. Rachel! She snapped, voice sharp with fury. I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to stop this nonsense. Delete that file. Apologize to your brother. We can move past this if you just admit you overreacted. I laughed bitterly, the sound catching in my throat. Overreacted? He tried to steal from me, Mom. You defended it. And Dad threatened to cut me off if I didn't play along. Do you realize how insane that is? Her voice cracked with venom. You're sick. You've let your pride twist you into someone cruel. He's your brother. You'll regret this when he's gone. The guilt clawed at me like always, but this time I hit record on my phone mid-call. My voice was steady when I said, if anything happens to me, to my accounts, or if you try to smear me to the family again, this recording goes public. Everyone will hear exactly what you've said, and I won't hesitate to press charges. For the first time, she was silent. Then she whispered, low and cold, You're no daughter of mine. The line went dead. I sat there in the quiet, phone still in my hand, feeling both gutted and strangely free. It wasn't the words that stung. They'd always treated me like an outsider. It was the finality of it, the door slamming shut on the tiny hope that maybe, one day, things would change. But some doors need to stay closed. That afternoon, I drafted the email again. This time, the words flowed. Family, I need you to know the truth. For years, I've been painted as selfish, cold, ungrateful. Here is what really happened. I attached screenshots of threatening texts, a summary of the attempted bank fraud, and the audio file of Ethan admitting what he'd done while my parents defended him. My finger hovered over send. My chest tightened. If I clicked, the facade of the Carter family would shatter forever. I closed my eyes, inhaled slowly, and pressed. The whoosh of the email leaving my outbox was quiet, almost anticlimactic, but it felt like a match struck in a dark cave, light, dangerous, and cleansing. That night, the fallout began. Aunt Margaret called first. Rachel, she said, her voice shaking, I read everything. I listened. I knew something was wrong all these years, but this is worse than I imagined. You're not crazy. You're not selfish. You've been carrying their lies. I choked back tears. I thought maybe I was losing it, that I was the villain they said I was. No, she said firmly. You're the only one seeing clearly, and you're not alone anymore. Her words wrapped around me like a blanket I'd never had as a child. Warmth, safety, belief. The messages from my parents turned frantic, then icy. Dad. This is defamation. You'll regret dragging us through the mud. Mom. How dare you betray us like this, after everything we gave you? But with every new message, my fear lessened. Their threats sounded smaller, weaker, like shadows shrinking under daylight. I blocked their numbers. Then I set my phone down and sat in silence, letting the quiet of my little house settle into me. For years, guilt had been my background noise, buzzing constantly. Now there was stillness. It didn't feel like joy yet. It felt like grief, like ripping off a bandage to expose a wound. But underneath was something healing. 2 days later, I met Aunt Margaret for lunch in Portland. She hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, and for once, I didn't pull away. You did the right thing, she said, as we sat by the window of a small diner, the rain streaking outside. Sometimes protecting yourself means burning the bridge. Let them choke on the smoke. I smiled weakly, stirring my coffee. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels like ashes. She touched my hand. Ashes are what you build from. That night, back in Seattle, I replayed the recording one last time. Ethan's careless admission, Mom's shrill defense, Dad's threat. Then I saved it to a secure drive, locked it away, and whispered to myself, no more secrets, no more chains. I had cut the cord, and though the wound still bled, it was mine. My choice. My freedom. When I hit send on that email, I thought maybe it would vanish into the void. Family members skimming past it, shrugging, deleting. A part of me braced for silence. I didn't expect the phone to start buzzing within the hour. The first call was from Aunt Margaret. She had already been in my corner, but hearing her voice now felt different, sharper, urgent. Rachel, you did it. I read everything. I listened. And I can't tell you how proud I am that you finally spoke up. It's going to rattle people, though. Be ready. My chest ached with relief. Just one person believing me out loud made me feel less like a ghost. Then the texts started pouring in. From cousins, uncles, even my grandmother who had somehow opened the audio file on her ancient computer. Is this real? I can't believe Ethan would do this. Rachel, thank you for telling us. I always suspected something was off. Every ping of my phone was a stone falling from my shoulders. For years, I'd been the scapegoat, the selfish one, the daughter who abandoned her family. And now the cracks in their story were widening for everyone to see. By evening, my inbox was a battlefield. One cousin, Mark, confessed in an email. He borrowed $2,000 from me last spring, said it was for a job certification course. Never saw it again. Another relative, Aunt Beth, wrote, "He convinced me to co-sign a car loan. Guess who's still making the payments?" The stories piled up, each one painting a picture I already knew by heart. Ethan spinning lies, my parents running cover, everyone else left bleeding. I scrolled through them at my kitchen table, shaking my head, half in fury, half in vindication. For so long I thought maybe I was the crazy one. But this wasn't just me. He had been conning all of us. Of course, my parents weren't silent. By 9 p.m., my father sent a furious email addressed to the entire family list. Rachel has distorted the truth. Ethan made mistakes, yes, but he is not a criminal. She has manipulated recordings and painted us all in the worst possible light. This is nothing but a smear campaign from a bitter daughter who has forgotten what family means. I sat back in my chair, reading it twice. My father, the man who once told me to my face that I wasn't welcome in the family if I didn't fall in line, was now accusing me of manipulation. Projection. Plain and simple. I drafted a reply, hands steady. The recording speaks for itself. Ethan admitted what he did, and you both defended him in your own voices. I don't need to manipulate anything. Your words are enough. If you're ashamed now, maybe you should ask yourselves why. And I hit send. The next day at work, I kept my phone on silent, but during lunch I checked social media. And that's when I saw it. My parents' carefully curated image cracking in real time. Church friends unfollowing them, neighbors leaving comments on their posts, subtle but cutting. Always two sides to every story. So sorry to hear what Rachel's been through. My mother's Facebook page, once filled with inspirational quotes about family values, went eerily quiet. No Bible verses, no cherish your loved ones posts. Just silence. I wasn't celebrating, not yet. But for the first time, the truth wasn't mine alone to carry. That evening, my phone buzzed again. A number I didn't recognize. I hesitated, then answered. Rachel? The voice was nervous, female. Yes, who is this? This is Samantha. I used to date Ethan. I gripped the phone tighter. What do you want? I saw your post. I needed you to know. You're not wrong. He used to brag about how easy it was to get things from people. He told me once he'd figure out a way to get what was his, no matter who he had to hurt. Her voice cracked. He scared me, Rachel. That's why I left. A chill ran through me. Did he ever mention me specifically? Silence. Then, yes. He said you owed him. That you'd never really get away. My skin prickled. I thanked her, voice tight, and hung up. It was one thing to know he resented me. Another to hear it confirmed by someone who had lived with him. That night, I called Aunt Margaret again. I needed to hear someone sane, someone steady. They're unraveling, she said matter-of-factly. Your parents built their whole reputation on being the perfect family who just happened to have one ungrateful daughter. Now people see the truth. It'll sting them more than any court case. I exhaled shakily. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels like I lit my whole childhood on fire. You didn't, she said firmly. They doused it in gasoline years ago. You just stopped covering the smoke. Her words landed like a bomb. The following week, I learned Ethan had been evicted. His roommate finally had enough after hearing about the fraud attempt. Apparently, people weren't lining up to live with someone who might drag them into criminal charges. I drove past his Tacoma complex one evening on my way back from a client visit, curiosity gnawing at me. His window was dark, blinds askew, a single garbage bag sat on the curb. It was strange. No triumph, no gloating, just a hollow sense of inevitability. For once, I wasn't the one cleaning up his mess. Back in Seattle, I sat on my porch steps, dusk settling over the neighborhood. My phone lay quiet beside me. No more pleading calls, no more threats, just silence. And in that silence, I finally let myself breathe. For years, I thought exposing them would make me a monster, that people would see me as cold, selfish, cruel. But now, the ones who mattered saw the truth, and the ones who didn't, well, I was done living for their approval. I whispered into the evening air, half prayer, half declaration. No more secrets. No more lies. And for the first time in my life, I believed it. When the dust began to settle, I expected silence, maybe even indifference. But the truth has a way of echoing louder than lies. Within a week of sending that email, the ripples reached every corner of the Carter family. I found out about Ethan first. One afternoon, as I sat in my office downtown overlooking Elliott Bay, my phone buzzed with a message from my cousin Tim. He got evicted. Roommate had enough. Apparently, Jason left in the middle of the night with 2 trash bags. Nobody knows where he's staying now. I read the text 3 times. I should have felt triumphant. For years, he'd lived off everyone else, and now, finally, he had to face reality. Instead, all I felt was a dull ache. That night, I drove past his Tacoma apartment again. The blinds were crooked, the window dark. The curb was littered with old beer cans and a discarded couch cushion. It looked less like someone had left and more like someone had been erased. I sat there in my car for a long time, headlights washing over the empty stairs. And even though I didn't cry, I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Because despite everything, he was still my brother. Meanwhile, my parents' world was collapsing in slow motion. Mom had always prided herself on being the perfect churchwoman, the one who organized bake sales and quoted scripture on Facebook. Dad was the respectable insurance man, golfing on weekends, telling stories about his 2 kids. But after my email, people started pulling away. Their neighbors in Bellevue stopped waving across the fence. Church friends excused themselves from lunch invitations. Dad's golfing buddies were suddenly too busy. I heard it through the grapevine, of course. Aunt Margaret called one evening, her voice tinged with both sympathy and disbelief. They're pariahs now. Rachel, they can't spin this. Not when the whole family's seen the proof. They're embarrassed. But instead of admitting it, they're blaming you. I leaned back in my chair, letting her words sink in. They've been blaming me my whole life. This is nothing new. But this time, she said, no one believes them. That hit me harder than I expected. For so long, I'd carried the weight of their narrative, that I was selfish, ungrateful, the villain of the Carter family. To hear that story crumble, to know people saw me clearly now, it felt like sunlight after decades of gray skies. Of course, Mom still tried. One evening, as I was making dinner in my Seattle kitchen, my email pinged. A message from her. Rachel, you don't understand what you've done. People are whispering. Your father is humiliated. You've destroyed our reputation. I hope you're proud of yourself. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling, not from guilt but from fury. I typed back one line. I didn't destroy your reputation. You did. I just stopped covering for you. And I hit send. The consequences weren't just theirs, though. They were mine, too. For the first time in my life, my phone wasn't filled with manipulative texts or desperate pleas. The silence was strange, almost eerie. I'd lived so long bracing for impact that peace felt unnatural. One Friday night, I sat on my porch with a glass of wine, watching the Seattle skyline glow in the distance. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of salt water from the sound. For the first time in years, I let myself relax. No buzzing phone, no sudden crises. Just me, the hum of the city, and the quiet knowledge that I was safe. But safety didn't erase the grief. There were nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying Dad's words in my head. If you walk out that door, you'll no longer be one of us. I had walked out. And part of me still mourned the family I wished I had, even as I accepted the family I really did. The hardest part wasn't losing them. It was admitting I never really had them in the first place. The strangest consequence, though, was this. Without the constant drain of my family's chaos, I finally had room to grow. At work, I felt sharper, clearer. I wasn't dragging invisible chains into meetings. I spoke up more, volunteered for projects, even got praise from my director for a presentation that would have terrified me months earlier. One colleague, noticing my sudden confidence, asked me to grab coffee. We ended up talking for hours, not just about work, but about boundaries, resilience, and what it means to build a life you actually want. His name was Daniel. For the first time in years, I thought maybe, just maybe, I was ready to let someone in again. The real turning point came at a family gathering I didn't attend, a cousin's wedding in Spokane. For weeks, I debated going. Part of me longed to show up, to prove I wasn't the monster they painted me to be. But when the day came, I stayed in Seattle. Later, Aunt Margaret called with the play-by-play. "Your parents sat alone," she said. "People were polite but distant. Nobody asked them to join their table. And when Ethan's name came up, the room went cold. Rachel, the tide has turned. They can't control the narrative anymore." I closed my eyes, breathing in the weight of those words. It wasn't victory I felt. It was release. As for Ethan, the last I heard he was working odd jobs, construction during the day, bar backing at night. His credit was wrecked, his bridges burned. For the first time, he was facing consequences that couldn't be deflected onto me. Do I believe he'll change? Honestly, no. But that's not my burden to carry anymore. One evening, as the sun dipped low over Puget Sound, I hosted dinner at my house. Just a few close friends, laughter spilling across the table, candles flickering against the walls. It wasn't the big, chaotic family dinners I'd grown up with. It was better. It was chosen. I raised my glass, smiling through the lump in my throat. "To honesty," I said, "and to building the family we deserve." The clink of glasses rang out like a benediction. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the scapegoat, the fixer, the responsible one carrying everyone else. I was just Rachel. Free. The night of the dinner party lingered with me long after my friends had gone home. Empty glasses stood on the table, candles guttered low, and laughter still seemed to echo faintly in the warm air of my little craftsman home. For the first time, I had filled a room not with obligation, not with guilt, but with choice. The next morning, I woke early. Seattle was gray and damp, the kind of spring morning where the clouds hovered heavy but the air smelled like renewal. I wrapped myself in a sweater and stepped outside onto my porch. The street was quiet, rain-slicked. A dog barked faintly 2 houses down, the sound carried by the stillness. I sat on the porch steps, coffee steaming in my hands, and let myself be still. It struck me then how different silence felt now. Once it had been suffocating, filled with unspoken rules and punishments, every quiet moment a trap waiting to snap. Now, silence was possibility. It was mine. Later that day, Aunt Margaret came by. She drove up from Portland, her old sedan pulling into my driveway with a squeak. When she stepped out, rain dusted her shoulders, but her smile was steady. "I wanted to see you with my own eyes," she said, wrapping me in a hug that smelled faintly of lavender and road coffee. Inside, we sat at the kitchen table. She glanced around, taking in the framed photos of my college graduation, a picture of me hiking in the Cascades, even a Polaroid of me laughing with friends on the coast. "You built all this yourself," she said softly. I swallowed hard, emotion rising. "Yeah, I did." Her hand covered mine. "That's what liberation looks like, Rachel. It's not about running from them anymore. It's about standing in what you've built." Her words stayed with me long after she left. The weeks turned into months, and slowly, the chaos that had once defined my life receded. Ethan worked odd jobs, I heard, construction, bartending, but he never reached out. My parents disappeared from social media altogether. Neighbors whispered, their church friends distanced themselves, and the facade crumbled. Sometimes guilt still pricked at me, sharp and sudden. I would picture Ethan younger, chubby fingers clutching video game controllers, or hear Dad's voice booming, "Set a better example." I'd feel the old tug, the urge to fix, to appease. But then I'd walk through my house, and touch the walls I paid for, the life I carved out with my own 2 hands. And the guilt would shrink, not vanish, but shrink, because guilt loses its power when you stop feeding it. One evening, months later, I found myself back at the University of Washington campus, giving a guest lecture for a career development seminar. I stood in front of a room full of students, all wide-eyed, still figuring out how to balance ambition and survival, when a girl in the front row asked, "How do you deal with family pressure while building your own life?" I paused, throat tightening. I thought of Tacoma, of Ethan's smirk, my father's grip on my arm, my mother's shrill voice screaming about blood on my hands. Then I thought of my porch, my chosen family laughing around my table, Aunt Margaret's lavender hug, and I told the truth. "You learn to choose yourself," I said, "and sometimes that means disappointing people who taught you that love was conditional. But freedom, your freedom, is worth it." The room was silent for a beat. Then heads nodded, and I saw something in their faces I hadn't seen in my own for years. Hope. That night, I drove home along I-5, the city lights blooming on the horizon, and I realized I wasn't carrying the weight anymore. The chains had fallen. I was free. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't see when I was younger. For years, I believed family meant sacrifice at any cost, that to say no was to be selfish, that love meant erasing myself for their comfort. But what I've learned is this: real love doesn't demand you empty yourself to fill someone else's void. Real family, whether by blood or by choice, celebrates your growth, respects your boundaries, and doesn't fear your strength. I spent decades carrying guilt that was never mine, playing a role I never auditioned for, and in the end, the only way out was to tell the truth, even if it meant burning the script they had written for me. The truth didn't destroy me. It saved me. So if you're listening to this and you've ever felt like the black sheep, the scapegoat, the one who never measures up, hear me now. You are allowed to choose yourself. You are allowed to build a life free of chains. And when you do, it won't just be survival. It will be liberation. If my story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, share this video, and leave a comment. Let's build a community where honesty is stronger than silence, and where choosing yourself is never selfish. It's brave.